Excellent, thank you. I hope you can all hear me. 20 minutes is a bit of a difficult time, as we were discussing last night by email. So I hope to cover everything I can. What I've done, and I'm really intrigued, having listened to the wonderful keynote talk just now, there are strange parallels that I hope you'll pull out as well, which is unexpected given how I'm dealing with the 12th and 13th centuries, and obviously you're dealing with the present and a presumed universal biology. So what I'm going to be looking at is as is implied in this title, which looks a bit light to me, unfortunately. But it is what I'm suggesting is that the term stress, as we use it, is a particularly modern phenomenon in the way in which we use it. And what I want to do is go back to look at moments before, say, the 18th, 19th, 20th century, when we can see moments, see parallels to, and query, well, how close is this to the modern notion of stress? So what I'll be looking at is my material that I'm working on for a larger project on sleep and its pathologies. As I've just mentioned, my main area of focus is specifically the 12th and 13th century, so the period for this country, not long after the Norman conquest, but it's an incredible period of expansion in terms of intellectual life and cultural and economic as well. The talk is organized into 3 short sections. The first kind of introduces medieval views of sleep, and it is relatively introductory if you're familiar with this material, but I'm guessing most of you are not. And then the second deals with that issue that is the main title, that question of what terms can we use and how do we historicize the term stress. But finally, the way to connect the two, and that is through pathologies, through various diseases, of which I hope to get to one called the nightmare or incubus, and the other being insomnia, most obviously. So let's turn to the actual definitions of sleep. And first to explain that there is an immense amount of material, even from just the centuries I look at, discussing, describing, querying what it is that is this entity that we call sleep. So they're asking not just what it is, but why it happens. They're asking how it happens, and of course also, on a more practical level, how we should sleep. So these ideas where they do, despite arguments of diphasic or segmented sleep, they do argue, in fact, that you should have 8 or 10 hours of sleep, with no indication of whether it should be complete, whole, or segmented. This, in large part, comes out of the most crucial text on sleeping and wakefulness, which is Aristotle's De Somno Vigilia. It's a text that doesn't get translated till the 12th century, but when it does, it is just commented on endlessly. And given that there's a lot of Oxford people in this room, it's actually University of Oxford in the 13th century that seems to be massively obsessed with kind of working with and interpreting this particular actually series of texts. It's on sleep, on dreams, and on divination in dreams. And by the way, he does argue that there is no divination in dreams, except for prognostic purposes. But what Aristotle is arguing, and this becomes the core of medieval views of sleep, is that there is this kind of binary opposition between the waking state and the sleeping state. So he has a negative definition of sleep as the opposite, the privation, the lack of wakefulness. And specifically, he argues that it is particularly an absence of sensation, particularly external sensation, but also external movement and activity. So this is the idea that the body is closing down outwardly because a number of very important internal phenomena are occurring. And the most important of this, though I mentioned the idea of restoration and the idea that sleep is connected with the notion of rest or quies, but specifically it's about kind of reproducing and strengthening not just the muscles, but also the humors, the various liquids of the body, blood, phlegm, and the 2 biles, red and black. But most importantly for the Aristotelian view of sleep is that sleep is when digestion occurs. And therefore you need to get enough sleep in order to be able to allow for that proper restoration. But most importantly, in a period before Harvey, this is part of a world that imagines that blood is reproduced on a daily basis, and that you need, that is to say, with no concept of the circulation of blood, you need the liver to be processing that food in order to produce enough blood for the body to survive. So it plays a very, very essential function, sleep that is, in allowing for the human to survive and also for allowing for wakefulness to occur. Now, I should explain that this slide I could spend about 5 hours on. It is actually what I work on, and in fact, primarily, we've just published last week a book, a collection of essays called Imagining the Brain, on the history of brain imaging. And this image, which comes from Cambridge University Library, is central to that. For those who are not familiar, again, I think there's probably many of you, there's a very different sense of how cognition works, though it has these strange, interesting parallels with modern views. And it's partially about mapping function onto the brain. So this is about kind of mind, that is cognition, and brain anatomy. And what I've identified, and I've labeled them here for you, is that in the front of the brain, and I'll run through this very quickly, is that which gathers all 5 of the external senses. So it's called the common sense. It takes in all the sounds and sights and smells that we experience during the day. The next circle, which I've identified, hopefully you can read it, it's called imagination, is what gathers those external sensations and turns them into sense impressions, the form, the shape, the memory, the short-term memory, in a sense, of those external sensations are retained in the imagination. Now, the focus of that language suggests that vision, image, is the most important there. The next 2 I'll identify very quickly are connected to the rational faculty, that is to say, the idea of judging. It's called estimation. Is what's a result of this processing that is the imagination, and then cognition or cogitation, that is rational thinking and thinking about consequences of things, occurs in the 4th category. And then finally, at the back of the brain, I noticed there's wonderfully, admittedly very simplified maps that the keynote discussed, where put memory towards the front, but in fact memory is seen as at the very far end back of the posterior ventricle, is the terminology of the brain. Now that's the normal waking brain state. What happens in sleep, as you see from my notes here, is that almost all of that is not operative in the sleeping state. And the only thing that is properly working is the imagination. This is that receptacle of those forms, those sense impressions, those images that we have experienced during the waking state. And this brings us to that final question that was asked about, huge question of how, what do you think of dreams, and where do they fit into this? Because that idea of the imagination is where precisely dream content, or at least dreams that were caused by bodily, or recognized to be natural or bodily caused, occur. That is to say, dreams that are thought to have some religious significance come from an external source, either God or saints, or perhaps even a demonic source. But many dreams, the ones that interest me the most, are those that are somatic and cognitive in nature. And those are connected to the imagination. And it's there that, as I note, the desires, the fears, the preoccupations of the waking state get returned, and very strange things happen. So we have sleepwalking, of which I and a colleague for the 18th century, for Sasha Handley, have written extensively. Also, as we'll see, the nightmare in particular, the incubus, and the image that I assume Sally chose for this symposium, the Goya capriccio of the sleep of reason produces nightmares. To me, that is the moment at which, if reason is literally asleep in this cognitive model, then what happens? Well, those forms that remain in the brain become associated with and twisted into these kind of often nightmarish forms. And I have a wonderful text that says, well, the sleeper their thoughts can either go move higher and towards rationality, or descend towards darker things. And the author simply says, and it is easier to descend than to rise. So the idea being that inevitably we will be having more likely nightmares than wonderful, rational dreams in which we logically debate with each other. So that's the basic and really, sadly, very, very basic notion of sleep as it's understood. I want to turn to kind of pre-modern notions of stress, and the question, can we apply this category to these earlier materials? The term stress, as we have it today, has a very kind of intriguing and slightly complicated origin. It comes from the Latin verb, which is about tightening or compressing, and it comes largely from the past participle strictum, that is then turned in Old French, Anglo-Norman, to stressum. So it's kind of this long, lengthy process. But weirdly, the earliest usage in English of that term comes from exactly the very end of the period I look at, so the very beginning of the 14th century. So in a religious text, a text that's about teaching basic church doctrine and church history, in Handling Sin, we have this reference to the Israelites moving or wandering in hard stress. And that idea is that it implies that this is largely physical rather than mental hardship. And it raises inevitably that issue of the mental and the physical and the relation between them. Now, keep in mind that the origins of that word, if it does come from as it seems to come from this verb to tighten or compress, has a very material and attached to the body somatic element to it. What I want to suggest is and I'll come back to this if I have time, is that ultimately that this focus on strain or tightening it becomes increasingly focused on pressure and strain, and that's in that kind of mechanistic sense. And I would say that it's very appropriate that we are here in the Royal Society, where that Cartesian idea of what becomes the mechanical philosophy gets applied to experimental science, and so people like Robert Boyle and particularly George Cheney are looking at the mechanistic understanding of the body, and particularly for Cheney, that idea of taut or loose nerves, and that stands in contrast, I would argue, to the more organic view of the humoral body with its economy of blood and phlegm and the biles. Now, in terms of language that's used in my materials, I just want to, again, I won't run through each of these, I don't have time, but I just want to point out a few common patterns. And I purposely have given you the language that I'm reading. That is to say, these are Latin terms, because the vast majority of my sources are Latin. But phrases like angustia and anxietas are largely, at least initially, again, have this very physical implication. Literally, angustia is narrowness, and often it refers to passages in the body or hallways or what have you. So there is absolutely, for that material, a primarily physical somatic element. But then these other words like solicitudo, curas, turbatus, and the verb inquieto bring something closer to a psychological element to all of this. That is to say, the idea of concern, of worry, of being disturbed or disquieted. And keep in mind that if sleep is a form of quiet or rest, then disquiet, inquieto, is the antithesis of that. So just to give you a sense of the variety of issues, and particularly that question of, well, are these mental, are these physical, and where is the connection between the psychological and the physiological in all of this? Not really sure where I am in terms of time, but I want to turn to the examples I have chosen, and I've mentioned two of them, and there are plenty of other options I could have looked at. And that is to say, where do these two elements, this question of sleep and this issue of anguish, sorrow, anxiety, whatever term we want to use to replace or parallel the concept of stress, where do they come together? And yes, it is in these issues of pathological conditions. I won't go into much detail on the terminology, but insomnia has a very strange terminological dilemma because the word vigilia can mean just normal wakefulness, that is, average, non-pathological. It can also be, of course, that religious sense of a vigil, awake, a watching, so a willed decision to stay up all night. But it can also, and usually in the plural, vigiliae, if you want to be Ciceronian about it, the vigiliae in the plural refers to that pathological status. So it is the disease category of that period. But occasionally, especially from the 13th century onward, we get a much more abstracted word. That ending of itas or etas is always the abstracted notion. And so insomnietas, insomnietas are stand in for that idea of vigils. It now becomes a singular and the abstraction of inability to sleep. And, okay, thank you, perfect. So what I want to point to, and I won't read these quotes out for lack of time, is that we have two interesting kind of opposite directions that are going, and this is where one of the first parallels with Russell's talk comes in. And that is that unlike Kraepelin, or even before Kraepelin, we have this reference in the first quote to the idea that actually insomnia can lead to anguish as well as physiological changes and the rise of worries, thoughts, alienation of the mind, referring to madness and forms of insanity, plus irrational suspicions and various other physical elements. In contrast to that, which is from Bartholomeus Anglicus, we have an important late 13th century, early 14th century author, so contemporary with that first use of stress in English, but he's writing in southern France, in Montpellier. Arnold of Villanova argues that we have this idea that the causes of stress, again, this shouldn't surprise us perhaps, include emotions, include kind of angry words, clamor, crying out, even, and this is written by scholars, so the idea that too much study can lead to insomnia is something they're quite aware of, and also these ideas of pressing worries and fear. Again, there's plenty more to say on all of this, but since I've been given the 5-minute mark, I will turn to my final example before turning to conclusions, and that is the category that I've referred to, that is the nightmare, the idea that in sleep you are actually being crushed. The sleeper believes that he is being crushed by some external force. Now, the physicians will take this, and they use the same term, the incubus, but they're saying, no, this is a physiological condition. It is simply a form of indigestion, and that you, because you are sleeping, and therefore your rational faculty isn't working, you wrongly interpret that sensation of weight as an external force. But in fact, it is an internal physiological origin. So they're arguing for this contrast. What we have is not just the medical literature, but a wonderful example from Canterbury of a wonderful story of a man who has this experience of these nocturnal terrors for 30 years or so, this miracle, if Thomas Becket goes. And he rejects the physician's views, but what I want to point to is the way he responds to this. So the terminology they're using is, he was in such anguish, in tanta angustia. And he cries out, he screams to his servants, help me. And he says, wake me up, push me into an upright position, pull my hair to make sure I awaken, because he's just absolutely terrified that he'll be killed in his sleep. And I should note that this is kind of breaking 12th century news. This is the first time people have seen this this glass. This is glass that was assumed to be a 20th century kind of fake version, but there's scholars right now who are looking at this material and realizing, oh, there's actually 13th century original glass in there. It's just been horribly changed. So this is a reconstruction that, I think this is the first outing of it publicly, of what this panel describing poor Stephen of Hoyland actually most likely looked like, with in the mirror, some of the miracle windows in the Trinity Chapel at Canterbury. So we have a variety of other wonderful stories that, while we can't trust them in terms of the experiences of the patients and sufferers they mention, they do give a flavor of how people interpreted these conditions in ways that are not explicitly medical. That is to say, this is not necessarily the patient's point of view, but it is a point of view that is not entirely that of physicians. So we have these wonderful tales of miracles that whose larger narratives are not as relevant to us, but these experiences that they're describing are. So what I'll end with, and I'm afraid I do have to end, is just to raise that question of, how much can we discuss this issue, this term of stress, and do all of the terms that I've mentioned, anguish, solicitude, cares, and disquiet, do they amount to the same thing as this thing that we call stress? And specifically what I want to point to is that there is a very close connection between the mental and the physical in all of this. It's no surprise, again, before Descartes, not in terms of his mechanistic views, but in terms of his mind-body distinction, it's no surprise that there is this blurring that's of both psychosomatic and what we call somatopsychic interactions. But at the same time, I do want to note that this perhaps is a very different view of how the body works. So that humoral focus on kind of, as I note here, superfluity of one humor and scarcity of another is very different from that mechanistic view, in which, even though we don't read George Chaney anymore, perhaps we should, we don't talk about taut or slack nerves in that same sense, but we do, in a popular sense, talk about highly strung people, and of course, we feel tense. So I'll leave it there, and hope that opens up discussion for later.